In September 1720, a London banker named Archibald Hutcheson sat down and did the arithmetic that nobody in power wanted him to do. He found that the stock of the South Sea Company was trading at roughly 5 times what it was actually worth. He published his findings, handed them out at his own expense on street corners, and was promptly ignored by virtually everyone, including Isaac Newton, the man who had quantified the force that keeps planets in orbit. Newton had already read the warnings. He read them, nodded, and poured more money in anyway. Within weeks, he lost the equivalent of several £1,000,000 in today's money. When someone later asked him about the South Sea affair, he reportedly said he could calculate the motions of the heavenly bodies, but not the madness of people. This is the story of that madness, and the terrifying part is that every mechanism that drove it is still alive today. To understand how Britain managed to lose its collective mind over a company that barely traded anything, you have to go back to a war. The War of the Spanish Succession had been grinding on since 1701, swallowing money at a rate that made the government's accountants visibly sweat. By the time the fighting slowed, Britain had accumulated a national debt of roughly £10 million, a figure that sounds quaint now but was, in the early 1700s, a civilizational problem. Parliament had no clean mechanism to handle it. The tax base was slow, the credit system was primitive, and the interest payments were starting to crowd out everything else the government wanted to do. Robert Harley, the first Earl of Oxford and a shrewd Tory political operator, looked at this mess and saw an opportunity. In January 1711, he chartered a new entity, the Governor and Company of the Merchants of Great Britain, trading to the South Seas and other parts of America. The name alone was engineered to make your imagination do the work. South Seas, Spanish America, gold, silver, the legendary wealth of Mexico and Peru, sitting there waiting to be tapped by clever English merchants. The pitch was seductive enough that Harley's real purpose, which was essentially to create a large, legitimate-looking vehicle for absorbing government debt, almost didn't matter. The company would take on a chunk of the national debt in exchange for government interest payments, and in return, it would get a monopoly on trade with Spanish South America. Win-win, said Harley. The public agreed. There was one detail that received insufficient attention in the promotional materials. Spain and Britain had been at war. Spain controlled every port, every colony, every customs house in the entire region. The idea that British merchants were going to sail down there and start doing profitable business, while a war was still technically in progress, required a level of optimism that crossed into hallucination. Harley was conducting secret peace negotiations with Spain at the very moment he was founding the company, and even he didn't know whether those negotiations would produce anything useful for trade. But the company was already incorporated, shares were already being issued, and the debt was already being absorbed. The show had to go on. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 did eventually end the war, and it did give Britain something, the assiento. This was a contract granting British merchants the right to supply 800 enslaved Africans per year to Spanish colonies in the Americas for 30 years, plus one annual ship for general trade. One ship per year for the richest trading empire in the Western Hemisphere. This was the entire commercial foundation of the South Sea Company, not the gleaming vision of silver mines and exotic goods that the promotional pamphlets had painted, but a single annual vessel and a slave trading quota. The trade itself proved difficult, contentious, and far less profitable than promised. Spain imposed taxes on the imported enslaved people. Wars kept breaking out and interrupting operations. Company factors in Cartagena and Veracruz and Buenos Aires haggled, bribed officials, and watched their margins evaporate. By 1720, the company had made essentially no meaningful profit from actual commerce. It was a trading company that didn't trade, and yet the stock price rose. This is the part that requires you to understand something about how early financial markets worked, because it matters enormously for understanding why this keeps happening. In 1720, in 1929, in 2000, and every time since. The South Sea Company's actual business was irrelevant to its stock price, because its stock price was being driven by something else entirely. The conversion of government debt. People who held government annuities, essentially IOUs from the Crown paying a fixed income for life, were being offered the chance to swap those annuities for South Sea shares. The company was betting that it could sell those shares to the public at a price high enough to generate a profit from the gap between what it paid for the debt and what it received from investors. This meant the company had a powerful incentive to make its stock price go as high as possible, by any means necessary. John Blunt understood this better than anyone. Blunt was the real engine behind the South Sea Company, a lawyer's son from Rochester who had made his way into London finance through the lottery business and a shady little operation called the Hollow Sword Blade Company, which was essentially a bank masquerading as a sword manufacturer. He was not a gentleman. He was smart, aggressive, and entirely comfortable with the gap between what he said publicly and what he was actually doing. When the opportunity came to propose that the South Sea Company take over not just part but all of Britain's unconsolidated national debt, roughly £31 million, Blunt seized it with both hands. The proposal went to Parliament in early 1720. For it to pass, Parliament had to vote for it, and Parliament needed to be convinced. Blunt's method of convincing Parliament was not subtle. He handed out South Sea Company shares to members of Parliament, to courtiers, to the King's mistresses. The Duchess of Kendal, who shared King George I's bed and a portion of his confidence, received a block of shares. The king himself, who had become governor of the company in 1718, was entangled in the enterprise in ways that made impartial oversight essentially impossible. Recipients of these gifted shares were not required to pay for them initially, and could sell them later at whatever price they happened to be at, which, given that those same recipients were voting to approve a scheme that would drive the price up, was a guaranteed windfall. This was insider trading on an almost farcical scale, sanctioned at the highest levels of British government. The Bank of England had also submitted a competing proposal to absorb the national debt, and Blunt beat them partly on the merits of his offer and partly by outspending them in bribes. Parliament voted in April 1720 to accept the South Sea Company's proposal. The share price, which had been sitting at £128 at the start of the year, immediately lurched to £310. But here is where it gets stranger. The price fell the very next day. On April 7, 1720, the day after Parliament formally endorsed the scheme, South Sea shares dropped overnight from £310 to £290. This tiny panic was enough to terrify the directors, who understood that their entire operation depended on maintaining upward momentum. If the price stalled, people who had bought on installment plans couldn't make their payments. If they couldn't make their payments, they'd sell. If they sold, the price would fall further, triggering more selling, and the whole cascade would unwind before anyone had made their money back. So Blunt did what he had always done when numbers got inconvenient. He invented new ones. The company launched a series of subscription offers, essentially new share issues that let people buy in with as little as 20% down and pay the rest in installments over several months. This was, functionally, buying stock on credit. And then Blunt went further. The company began lending money directly to investors so they could buy more shares, accepting those same shares as collateral. You could walk into the South Sea Company's offices, get a loan backed by shares you didn't yet own, use that loan to buy more shares, watch those shares go up, then use the increased value of those shares to borrow even more. It was a machine designed to generate the sensation of wealth without requiring any of the underlying reality. The share price responded accordingly. By June, it was at £700. By early August 1720, it touched £1,000. At that price, the South Sea Company was valued at something approaching £300 million, roughly 80% of Britain's entire gross domestic product. A company that had made essentially no profit from actual trade was worth more than the country's annual economic output. People knew something was strange. They talked about it in the coffee houses, but they kept buying. Change Alley in the city of London had transformed into something that contemporaries struggled to describe without resorting to religious metaphor. The narrow lane connecting Cornhill to Lombard Street, a passage barely wide enough for two people to pass comfortably, had become the center of a national obsession. Jonathan's Coffee House, where stock prices had been chalked on the walls since 1698, was now so crowded that business spilled out onto the cobblestones. Garraway's, just a few yards away, was the same. Carriages clogged the surrounding streets for blocks. Clergymen and ship captains and widows and merchants and young men who'd borrowed from their families all pressed in together, waving papers, shouting prices, trying to catch the eye of anyone who could sell them in. The air smelled of coffee and pipe smoke, and the particular human anxiety of people who believe they are about to miss the greatest opportunity of their lifetimes. Not everyone was buying South Sea shares specifically. The mania had spread. Nearly 200 new joint stock companies had sprung up in the wake of the South Sea fever, offering investment opportunities in everything from insurance to fisheries to a wheel that would achieve perpetual motion. One company raised capital on the promise of importing ash from Spain. Another proposed to improve the breed of horses in England while simultaneously repairing church buildings, without explaining what the connection between those two activities might be. One promoter, and this detail has the quality of a punchline that is also deadly serious, advertised a company for carrying on an undertaking of great advantage, but nobody to know what it is. He collected £2,000 in subscriptions in a single morning and was never seen again. The South Sea directors found this copycat enthusiasm threatening rather than flattering. Every new bubble company was competing for the same speculative capital that was supposed to be flowing into South Sea shares. So they did something breathtaking in its hypocrisy. In June 1720, at the company's lobbying, Parliament passed the Bubble Act, which made it illegal to establish a joint stock company without a royal charter. The South Sea Company, itself a pyramid of paper and borrowed money, had successfully lobbied to ban its competitors for being too speculative. The Bubble Act passed, the rival companies collapsed, and for a brief moment the scheme seemed to have worked. South Sea shares jumped to £890 on the news, but shutting down the rival bubbles had an unintended consequence. All that speculative energy that had been inflating the satellite companies suddenly had nowhere to go, and it turned out that investors who'd borrowed to buy into those now illegal schemes desperately needed cash to repay their loans. Cash, in that environment, meant selling what you had, and what they had was South Sea stock. The price began to fall in August, slowly at first from £1,000 000 to pound 900, then pound 800. At this precise moment, in late August 1720, several South Sea Company directors, the people with the most intimate knowledge of the company's actual financial position, quietly sold their holdings. John Blunt himself liquidated his personal position. These sales were not announced. They were conducted through intermediaries discreetly, while the company's public statements maintained that everything was fine. It was not fine. By September, the price was at pound 400. The first installment payments on the spring subscription offers were due, and investors who had bought at inflated prices on credit found themselves in a vice. To pay their installments, they needed cash. To get cash, they needed to sell shares. Every sale pushed the price down further, making the shares worth less than the loans they'd been used as collateral for, triggering demands from lenders for additional payment, which required more selling. The Sword Blade Company, the unofficial bank that had been clearing South Sea transactions and lending money to speculators, ran out of cash and suspended payments in September. Banks across London found themselves holding collateral that was rapidly losing value against loans they couldn't recover. By December, South Sea shares were trading at pound 124, almost exactly where they had been in January. The entire year had been a loop, and anyone who had bought at the peak had lost everything. The human wreckage was not abstract. Thousands of investors, not just the wealthy but merchants, professionals, minor gentry, widows living on the fixed income they'd converted into shares, were financially destroyed. Suicides increased. The streets of London carried a low, persistent sound of fury. Letters from the period describe a kind of social vertigo, people unable to believe that something so visible and so massive had simply been allowed to happen. Edward Harley wrote in April 1721 that nothing arises or increases here but uneasiness, discontent, and clamor which reigns in every part of the city. And Isaac Newton, the man who had worked out the mathematics of gravity, who had built the calculus, who had served as master of the Royal Mint, and spent his later years ensuring the integrity of British currency, had reinvested near the top after selling early at a profit of pound 7,000, and lost somewhere close to pound 20,000, possibly more. He had watched the price climb past every rational valuation, told himself perhaps that this time was different, and jumped back in at precisely the wrong moment. He reportedly refused to discuss the subject for the rest of his life. Now for the part that doesn't get enough attention. The immediate political fallout was swift and merciless, but also carefully managed by the one man who understood that a crisis of this magnitude was an opportunity if you moved quickly enough. Robert Walpole had opposed the scheme vocally, had written pamphlets warning against it, and had, this is the part his admirers tend to gloss over, also quietly bought into it himself and sold at the right time. He emerged from the crash with both his reputation and his fortune more or less intact, which is a trick available only to those who understand the mechanism well enough to play both sides. Parliament convened a committee of secrecy in February 1721 that met behind closed doors until June. What it found was staggering. The company's books had been falsified. Shares had been issued to politicians and courtiers as bribes recorded in company ledgers under fake names. Chancellor of the Exchequer John Aislabie had accepted a substantial bribe and speculated personally. He was expelled from Parliament and imprisoned in the Tower of London. Postmaster General James Craggs the Elder, before the investigation could reach him, died. Some accounts say of shock, others of illness, the contemporaries not always distinguishing carefully between the two. His son, Secretary of State James Craggs the Younger, died of smallpox during the hearings. Lords Stanhope and Sunderland were impeached. The directors of the company had their personal estates seized and partially redistributed to investors, though John Blunt, who had cashed out early and then cooperated extensively with the committee, naming names in exchange for leniency, kept his baronetcy. The family still holds it. The king, who had not sold his shares before the collapse, was also facing financial embarrassment and considerable damage to his reputation. It fell to Walpole to manage this too, ensuring that the investigation's findings were channeled in directions that protected the crown's dignity. His critics called him the Screen Master General, a reference to his skill at screening powerful figures from the consequences of their involvement. Satirical prints circulated showing him literally screening the guilty behind a curtain. He didn't much care. By April 1721, Walpole was First Lord of the Treasury, Chancellor of the Exchequer, and leader of the House of Commons simultaneously, a concentration of power without precedent in British constitutional history. Historians generally regard him as the first Prime Minister of Great Britain, a position that did not yet have that name but functioned in every meaningful way as that office. The South Sea Bubble had destroyed the careers of every senior political figure in Britain, except the one who was clever enough to oppose it publicly while profiting from it privately, and then step into the vacuum it left. Walpole's reconstruction plan was elegantly ruthless. He arranged for the Bank of England and the East India Company to absorb portions of the South Sea Company's outstanding shares, which offered some relief to investors and stabilized the broader market. He restructured the national debt, dividing what the South Sea Company held between the Bank of England, the Treasury, and the sinking fund, a dedicated reserve into which government surplus income would flow until the debt was paid down. This was not simply crisis management. It was the architecture of modern British public finance, built out of the wreckage of a scam. The sinking fund in particular became a model for how governments could handle debt in ways that didn't require periodic panic and collapse. The Bubble Act, paradoxically, survived the disaster that its authors had helped cause. Its requirement that joint stock companies obtain a royal charter before operating stayed on the books until 1825, over a century after the crash. During those 100-plus years, the British economy was effectively barred from one of the central mechanisms of capital formation that would later drive industrialization. Historians have argued that this delay had real consequences, that the difficulty of forming joint stock companies in Britain pushed industrial investment into partnerships and family firms, which were less capable of raising the capital needed for large-scale manufacturing, and that this bottleneck slowed the pace of the Industrial Revolution relative to what it might have been. The South Sea Bubble didn't just ruin thousands of families. It may have delayed the most transformative economic development in human history. What the crash did create, perversely, was the infrastructure of the modern financial system. The Bank of England emerged from 1720 with its authority dramatically enhanced and its role as lender of last resort clarified. The legal and administrative framework for managing government debt that Walpole built in the aftermath became the template for how Britain, and eventually every major Western economy, would handle the relationship between sovereign debt and capital markets for the next 3 centuries. The concept of a central bank as stabilizing institution, the idea of a sinking fund to pay down sovereign debt, the requirement for transparency in corporate structure, the regulatory oversight of share issuance. All of these emerged or were consolidated in direct response to the South Sea collapse. Jonathan's Coffee House in Change Alley where the frenzy had reached its peak, eventually became the London Stock Exchange. The fire of the bubble had forged the institutions that replaced it. But here is the thing that should make you genuinely uncomfortable. Every single mechanism that drove the South Sea bubble is perfectly legal today. Companies can issue shares to drive their own price up. Executives can take stock compensation packages that give them a direct financial incentive to boost short-term valuations regardless of underlying business health. Governments can give monopolies to politically connected enterprises. Investors can borrow against their existing positions to buy more of the same asset. None of this is uniquely 18th century. What was different in 1720 was simply the scale at which the fraud was unacknowledged. The participants hadn't yet developed the vocabulary of plausible deniability that modern markets have refined into an art form. John Blunt didn't have a team of lawyers and a compliance department and a carefully worded prospectus. He just did it, and everyone at the top knew, and they all assumed the music would keep playing long enough for them to walk away. The music always stops. Isaac Newton was not a fool. He understood compound interest and capital markets better than almost anyone alive. He had sold at a profit the first time, which means he understood at some level that the price was too high. And then, because he watched people he knew making more money than he'd made, because the price kept going up when it should have come down, because the mechanism of a bubble creates a pressure that no amount of intelligence fully immunizes you against, he went back in. The second loss was larger than the first gain. This is not a story about stupidity. It is a story about what happens to rational people when an entire social and financial ecosystem is oriented around a single direction: up. The Dutch had a similar episode with tulip bulbs in the 1630. The French had John Law's Mississippi Company collapse in the same year as the South Sea bubble, 1720. The two crashes fed each other across the channel as capital fled both markets simultaneously, producing what historians at Yale's School of Management have since identified as the first international stock market crash. These events produced the same sermons, the same pamphlets, the same promises that something like this would never be allowed to happen again. 300 years later, in September 2008, a financial institution called Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy after it became clear that the mortgage-backed securities it had been packaging and selling were worth a fraction of their stated value. The instruments were different. The vocabulary was different. The amounts involved were incomparably larger. But the core mechanism, debt repackaged as equity, valuations driven by the expectation of continued price growth rather than underlying income, collateral loops where borrowed money was used to buy assets that were used as collateral to borrow more money, was the same loop John Blunt had run in 1720. The people who got out early as then did so quietly. The people who stayed in because they believed the price would keep climbing as then lost everything. The South Sea bubble did not teach the lesson that needed to be taught. No bubble ever does, because the lesson is not about the mechanism. Every educated person in 1720 England knew about tulip mania. Pamphlets about it had been published within living memory. They bought South Sea shares anyway, because knowing that a bubble exists in the abstract is categorically different from believing that the specific thing you are watching rise in front of your eyes right now is that bubble. Bubbles feel from the inside like opportunity. The people warning about them feel from the inside like people who are going to miss it. Archibald Hutcheson, the pamphleteer who did the arithmetic and found the stock was worth around £200, was right. He was right in January 1720 when the stock was at pound 128. He was right in June when it was at pound 700. He was right in August when it touched pound 1000. Being right didn't make him money. It made him irrelevant, then briefly famous after the crash, then forgotten. The Committee of Inquiry cited his pamphlets as evidence of what could have been known. Nobody gave him a government position. Robert Walpole, who had profited from the bubble, helped design the fraud's legislative approval, and then stepped forward to manage the cleanup, governed Britain for the next 20 years, and is remembered as the founder of modern cabinet government. He died a wealthy man. John Blunt lost almost everything in the crash but retained his baronetcy and his freedom, having cooperated with investigators just enough to avoid prosecution. He lived until 1733. The South Sea Company itself, the empty vessel at the center of the greatest financial fraud Britain had ever seen, did not collapse. It was restructured, its debts reallocated, its directors purged, and then it continued to operate for over a century. It conducted its slave trade operations through the 1720 and into the 1730, purchasing tens of thousands of enslaved Africans, of whom the company's own records show roughly 1 in 9 died on the crossing. And it maintained its government debt functions until the national debt it held was finally paid off. The South Sea Company was only formally dissolved in 1853, 142 years after Robert Harley dreamed it up to solve a budget problem. The city it left behind was different in ways that still persist. The Bank of England on Threadneedle Street, the framework of government bonds and gilt markets that let Britain borrow cheaply enough to fight the Napoleonic Wars, fund the Industrial Revolution, and build an empire. The London Stock Exchange that grew out of Jonathan's Coffee House in Change Alley, now relocated and rebuilt, but tracing its lineage to the same narrow alley where 18th century Londoners stood in the rain waving subscription certificates. The role of the Prime Minister as the central executive figure of British government. The regulatory principle that financial institutions require oversight, because left to their own devices, they will, reliably, do exactly what John Blunt did. The price of South Sea shares had been pound 128 in January 1720. It was pound 124 in December of the same year. Everything in between, the climb to pound 1000, the fortunes made and lost, the parliamentary corruption, the suicides, the panic, the investigation, the restructuring of British government, had produced a net change in share price of -£4. The company had gone nowhere. The country had been transformed. That is what a bubble does. It doesn't just redistribute money from the unlucky to the lucky. It reshapes the institutional landscape that everything else has to grow in afterward. Sometimes those institutions are improvements. The modern financial regulatory framework, inadequate as it often proves to be, exists because of crashes like this one. Sometimes the institutions are constraints that last too long. The Bubble Act's century-long lockout of joint stock companies being the obvious example. Always, the crash produces a story that the survivors tell themselves. A story about how the people who got ruined were foolish or greedy, or should have known better. A story that carefully omits the fact that the smartest man alive, at the peak of his intellectual powers, did not see it coming either. Newton could calculate where a comet would be in 50 years. He could not calculate the point at which the collective decision to believe something would reverse. Nobody can. That is the madness. And it will happen again, because it is not a malfunction of human cognition. It is a feature of the way human beings process social information, copy each other's behavior, and mistake rising prices for evidence that an asset is worth buying. The South Sea Bubble was the first global financial crisis. It was not the last. The next one will have a different name, a different architecture, different promotional vocabulary, different scapegoats. But somewhere in its DNA, if you look closely enough, you will find the ghost of John Blunt, a lawyer's son from Rochester with a talent for making numbers say what he needed them to say, offering people the chance to get rich on something that didn't really exist.